a huge pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar from the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. I'm Paul Collins. I'm the current chair of trustees of the Institute. And I know for many of you, I should actually be saying welcome back, as this evening is really a resumption of a program of monthly talks the Institute has offered in the first half of this year. And we took something of a summer break, even if we didn't have much of a summer. And now we're resuming with a talk by a distinguished colleague and a great friend and supporter of the Institute, Dr. Stephanie Dalley. But before I formally introduce her this evening, I'd like to just say a few words for those of you who may be joining us either for the first time or may not know the Institute. We are the UK's leading institution for arts, humanities and social sciences research and education on Iraq. We offer a range of grants for research projects and conferences. We fund and organise lectures, study days and other public events, both in London, elsewhere in the UK and in Iraq itself. So I would invite you to consider very much becoming a member of the Institute, and indeed help us to continue this work. Indeed, it would help us to continue lectures like the one you are about to hear this evening. And I know very much that this lecture will raise lots of questions, and I would invite you to write those in the Q&A tab, which you will find at the bottom of the screen. So please, if you're inspired to ask a question, please type that into the Q&A tab. I will then read those to Stephanie following her lecture. So without further ado, it really is a huge pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Stephanie Dalley. She's a member of the Oriental Institute at the University of Oxford and an Honorary Senior Research Fellow of Somerville College. She taught Akkadian and Sumerian at Oxford for nearly 3 decades. She's excavated in the Middle East and published cuneiform texts uncovered in countries across Iraq, Syria, and Jordan, as well as, of course, those in museum collections ranging from Baghdad, Oxford, London, and Edinburgh. Her bibliography is extensive, and it would take more than an hour, I think, to work through it all, and ranges across an extraordinary range of interests, touching on aspects of the ancient world and ancient Mesopotamia. But her books are also incredibly impressive. I'll mention a few. Myths of Mesopotamia from 1986 remains at the top of a well-known online booksellers list for the ancient Middle East as a top seller. Mari and Karana, 2 old Babylonian cities from 1984, remains among certainly my favorite publications. Huge resource and important for teaching. Her book, Esther's Revenge at Susa in 2007, another important addition to her bibliography. But it's her latest book, in many ways, that we're here to recognize this evening, and I'll hold up a copy for you to see, and you have it on the screen in front of you anyway. The City of Babylon. This is really, I was privileged to have an early copy of the book. Thank you, Stephanie. And it really is an extraordinary feat and feast of learning. So it's a great privilege to have you here to speak on that topic this evening. And I'm especially grateful to Stephanie for delivering this talk on Zoom because she's not a social media user. And so you're out of luck if you're a Facebook or a person who is does tweets and Twitter. You have no chance of her reaching her that way. But you have a chance here to hear about this extraordinary new work, and where she'll be talking about the City of Babylon, a history from around 2000 BC to AD 116. So Stephanie, over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Awful lot of books that have the name Babylon in their, as the main word in their title. And some of them barely mention Babylon itself, casting their net much wider to sketch the ancient history of Mesopotamia, including the time before Babylon came into the frame. And some of them gave Mesopotamia, some of them gave the whole history of Babylon in about 3 pages. That covers about 2 millennia. But some of them, like their readers, didn't read cuneiform and concentrated mainly on biblical and Greek texts, which weren't, in my opinion, really Babylonian at all. It always included the Tower of Babel, the Hanging Garden of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel in the lion's den, and all that. Now, some concentrated on the use or misuse of the name Babylon in much later times, long after thrones were abandoned there. Until quite recently, their accounts ended with Cyrus, claiming that his dynasty ended the many indigenous kings who ruled in Babylon before him. Well, what about the Kassites, I wondered? They were not indigenous. Why stop at Cyrus? In some accounts, Alexander ended the history, implying that Greek customs swamped 2,000 years of civilization that had established written laws and literature and impressive administration, and the education that lies behind them. Or else the accounts wandered off into Assyria, as if Assyrians and Babylonians were the same, and they're not. 3 wonderful exhibitions on Babylon, held in Berlin, Paris, and London, seem to give a relatively short account of the city, framed by long sequences of the history of excavation and the legends that grew up around the city and its kings when knowledge of the real thing was lost. So although I've read quite a few of those books, or parts of them, I found I didn't really know very much about Babylon, and I decided that the best way to do it was to start thinking of writing a book to fill that gap. Now, by a lucky chance, many years ago, when I was working on unpublished cuneiform tablets in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, I happened to meet a scholar from Leipzig, Joachim Oelsner. To my surprise and delight, he gave me a copy of his book, written in German, published in 1986 in Budapest. Its 547 typewritten pages, no IT then, were packed with information on cuneiform sources of the Hellenistic period. I had learnt nothing about them in my university courses, neither in Cambridge nor in London. Where, I wondered, was all that Hellenistic influence that had allowed histories of Babylon to end with Cyrus or Alexander? I've been trying to catch up ever since, not least by writing this book. It was only while immersed in the process that I discovered, to my amazement, that Trajan had visited the city, a fact that seemed to be unknown to some of my colleagues, as it had been to me. So that was one of my aims in writing this book. Also, I'd published a group of tablets that showed quite clearly, I think, that Babylon had not been abandoned during this 2,000 years. There was a period around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, when the city was meant to have been abandoned, some thought, for up to 400 years. But there was no evidence for that, either archaeologically, and it was built on a gap in evidence. The new tablets that I published shows that there wasn't a gap, and there's been a flood of tablets published since then that confirm that. I was also interested in the way that the Greeks and the Bible were the main attractions for people writing about Babylon. And it seemed to me that the most important thing that happened in the history was its relationship with Elam, which is to the east of Babylon. Right. Now, the picture you're looking at was taken by me in 1967, I think, from Babylon. And what you see on your right is a wall from the Summer Palace. And this was built by Nebuchadnezzar And as we'll see, that's partly because his big palace down on another part of the citadel kept getting flooded, and he kept having to raise the floor levels. Must have been horrendous. So wisely, he built himself a summer palace up here. And you see how high the mound of Babylon is. Nobody, I think, has ever got down to the lower level from which it was built. You can see the river Euphrates, or a branch of it, going along there, very far down from this mound on which the summer palace was built. Now, you can see from here that the building work is done in mud brick and reed matting. And this is a city that is built on earth, on mud brick, and occasionally baked mud brick. So it is not a stone-built city, and that's partly why it looked so dreadful when the Greeks came there, because of course they loved their glamorous stone marble monuments. And there we are. Here is a map, and you can see Babylon. I'm pointing to it here. I hope you can see that. Can you see the cursor?
Yes, we can see it, yes.
You can see it. Good, okay. So here's Babylon, and it lies on the Euphrates. What I've done in the book is to try to divide up more than has been done, I think, before, into 4 different kingdoms. No, it's disappeared again. There's Babylonia, which is this part here, and then there's the Sealand, which I think largely deserves to be seen as a different kingdom for almost all of the time that I've got in my book, from about 2000 down to down to Trajan, really. So I consider it to be different from Assyria, which lies on the Tigris, not the Euphrates, and the kingdom of Hana, which is also very much a cuneiform kingdom. In fact, we found quite a lot of tablets now from the cities there. The early kings of Mari were called King of Mari and Hana, so it went, that was the area that they considered to be under their control. There's a very important kingdom here at Aleppo, which is not a cuneiform kingdom, as I'm calling it now. The city of Haran up here is provided the kings, the last kings of Assyria, which hasn't quite been brought out before. And then the other place I'm going to talk about is Elam, this place which was very much in charge of parts of the Middle East, going all around here and around here, but in the time of Hammurabi, which I shall mention in a minute. Now, it's quite difficult to find the early evidence of anything in the time of Hammurabi, who ruled around 1800 BC, because mud brick is totally recyclable. And so when you want to build anything, you knock down the previous building and make your new mud bricks from it. The first museum in Baghdad was founded or was organized by the wonderful Gertrude Bell, who founded also this society of the British Institute for the Study of Iraq. And that's a picture of it, rather dominated by Assyrian things on the outside, because there's practically nothing in stone from Babylon. The first excavations were done away in the at the very, very end of the 19th century by the proper excavations by Koldewey from Berlin, a really wonderful man who spent all the time, the whole year of every year until 1917, when the British came into Baghdad and they had to stop their work there. But they were, and then of course there was some looting of their workshops on the site. But this gives you some idea of the enormous depth to which you had to dig to get to some of the buildings. This is above the Temple of Marduk, and you can see somebody standing up here on the very top of that trench, and the workmen are having to haul everything that they dig up and up and up and out of the trench to this level at the very, very top of the photograph. But when Koldewey dug there had already been some great finds of Babylonian monuments. And this one, which is absolute charmer, it's, I think it's not in the Louvre Museum. I think it's still in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. But it was brought back by Louis XIV's gardener, who was obviously a great explorer looking for plants all over the place. And he brought it back because it's really very small. It's 45 centimeters high. And I always think with the photographs that one has, one simply can't see what kind of size you've got. You could imagine that that was very much bigger than it is. And that brings the point that so much of what we have is minuscule. The writing is minuscule. The motifs on the top of this black limestone stone, they're all tiny, rather in the tradition that is also found on cylinder seals. But it must have been a bit galling for Koldewey that it was before him that so much was found. And I think it was while he was excavating that, in fact, the stela with Hammurabi's code, the monument that so many of you will know that stands proudly in the Louvre, was found at Susa, which at that time was under French control. So it ended up in Paris. So in the time of Hammurabi, we've got Babylon here, and we've got all sorts of other cities very close indeed. And when I started writing the book, I said to myself, well, I suppose that Babylon must have a commanding position in some way. You know, you look at the location, you say, this city was successful for 2,000 years because, and I couldn't find a because. It seemed to me a bit of a surprise that Babylon became the one to succeed, although it was so close to so many other cities around here. And it's one of its great allies, Sippar, is not so far off. But what we'll look at here also is how the water comes down the Euphrates here from Mari, and it will tumble down here. And when it gets to Sippar, luckily there's a canal that leads across into the Tigris from quite early times. But in fact, the whole of this apparently emptier area here was absolutely riddled with canals. So it's now thought that you could get from Susa, this western capital of the Elamites, that you could get all the way to Lhasa, for example, by boat. So,
Stephanie, sorry to interrupt you. I think we're one slide behind. We're still looking at the Kuduru.
Thank you.
There we are.
Sorry. Thank you, Paul. Yes, so here we've got the top of Hammurabi's code. And you can see that that's just the top of it. The whole thing goes down in a great
we're
column.
on the map at the moment.
It's very confusing having two screens. My brain's not up to it. Right, on the map, we're looking at an area that is covered in canals that link all the different cities and where most of the transport is done by boat. And Susa here is the Elamite capital from which you could travel by boat, it is now thought, all the way down to at least to Lhasa. So here we have the stela of the top of the stela of Hammurabi's law code inscription. And the king is quite unimpressively dressed, you could say. I know we haven't got any color, of course, in any of these monuments, but you'll see he's got a rather plain looking hat. And he has a huge beard, which we think is natural, not an artificial beard. And here is the sun god, who is the god of justice, who you know is the god because he's got these horns on his crown, because he wears this flounced robe, and because he has his feet on a mountain, and he rises, of course, over the mountains to the east of Babylon, the Zagros Mountains, every morning. And he sits on a throne, which is here, which is like the entrance to a temple with these this facade of stepped mud brick. And we'll see that that is the traditional way of doing temple walls and doorways, but for a while it wasn't. And there's a good reason, I think, for that. Now, I mentioned that Aleppo was one of the most important places, a West Semitic speaking place, city, known as Halab at that time. And we know that Hammurabi's successor, Samsu-Iluna, actually celebrated the New Year festival for this god under his West Semitic name, Adu. So this was found in Babylon and must have been brought over. It's basalt, which is the stone used very much in Syria. He's the storm god with his lightning rods and his axe and his rather Hittite-looking upturned slippers. But the point is that this is one of many things that stood on the processional way in Babylon. So when we come to Babylon and its processional way, you're going to start to think about what you could see if you walked along it in the way of old monuments, proclaiming the widespread interests and connections of Babylon itself. And also on that processional way was this wonderful statue made of diorite, a very hard stone that comes from the region probably of Oman, or perhaps from southern Iran. And his hat, which must have been like Hammurabi's hat that we've just seen on his stela, was remodeled to put on one set of horns to make him a deity. And he's got this wonderful curled beard, terrific beard, and very smart garments. And he was virtually the king, I think, of Mari, where we know a certain amount about him. But we don't know exactly why he was taken to Babylon from Mari, possibly at the time when Hammurabi conquered the city of Mari. So there's another glory for our processional way. Now, what I've done here is to give some idea of the canals that were dug across the country, lining up all these different cities. I'm still keeping the sea land as a separate place where the cities of Eridu and Ur, Larsa and Uruk are all in what I would call the sea land. There must have been some cities here in this area, probably also Lagash and Girsu, but they belong to the previous period very much. So I've left them out. I didn't try to give an introduction to the earlier period because, as I've seen with some of the books about Babylon, they never stopped talking about the period before Babylon got going. And it seemed to me that it requires too many pages to do that job properly. So we start very much with the dynasty to which Hammurabi belonged, which started quite a lot earlier than him. But what this map is designed to show, and I hope you can see the little asterisks, that each temple in the major cities had a practice where mostly royal women of royal blood, became priestesses, or we call them priestesses for want of a better word, who actually engaged in trade, and they traveled, and they had their own supply of silver, and they paid for things from that supply of silver. And I like to think that it's a way of, if a poor family has too many daughters, you can't afford to have dowries for all of them. So you put them into a temple, and they enrich you instead of impoverishing you. So you'll see the number of cities that had priestesses of Marduk. A lot of them had priestesses of Shamash, the sun god, because Sippar had the most tremendous temple dedicated to the sun god. Also, of course, at Larsa, there was the main temple dedicated to the sun god as well. That's a Sealand sun god, whereas this one is, I suppose, a Babylonian sun god. But you'll see that the influence comes up here, where there are also priestesses of Marduk. So they're spreading up along the Euphrates to enrich Babylon by their, and Sippar, of course, by their commercial activities. Isin here has got some. They are a bit difficult to see on this map. Right. So it is an enormous problem to Babylon, which is down here on this map, that the river Euphrates, when it floods in the spring, when the snow melts in the mountains, where it's right out of reach, where it, of this map, and the water comes tumbling down here, and you can see as the land flattens out here, it begins to have a very curvaceous course. And it comes down, and there's a branch of it that comes down to Babylon, and it floods everything down here. So Hammurabi's son, Samsu-iluna, built a terrific canal to lead the water off just before it gets to flood in the lowland. Now, he cut the first part of this canal, and we know this from one of his year names. He cut the first half, and then there was a big rebellion. It took a long time for him to get sorted on it, but he did get sorted on it. And afterwards, it's clear from his year names that he continued his work. He cut the second bit of the canal, once he got the rebellion under control, so that the water first of all came into Lake Habbaniyah, where the great Air Force base was in the First World War and the Second. And he cut this canal here to get water into Abu Dibis, so that there was plenty of room for all this water. And it was an attempt to stop this dreadful flooding that affected all the cities. So one of the things I was interested in in writing the book was whether clay tablets, which of course are not organic, and that's why they survive, and it's a blessing for us that they have survived, whether that clay of the clay tablets with their cuneiform was the only or even the main material for writing on. And I think there's very little doubt that it wasn't altogether, except at certain periods when it is very much used for administration and sometimes for official correspondence. But for example, we never seem to get any full treatises which are written on clay. We get excerpts which seem to be to go to and fro between two rulers in order to agree on a particular part of a treaty. But we know from the Hittites and from the Egyptians that they would write full treatises on stone or even on metal. Now, I was very interested, therefore, in my work on these Sealand tablets. The Sealand kings, just for a short time with two kings, took over Babylon at the very end of Hammurabi's dynasty. And one of the clay tablets that they had, administrative tablets, had on it, on the side, it had an alphabetic inscription. And that was perhaps, you could say, around 1600 BC. So we've always thought of the alphabet as coming from the Levant. And I think that we simply haven't had enough evidence to be right about that. This shows that there is writing, the tablet that I haven't shown you. But this item here gives a clue to it because it comes from the Yemen and it's on a date palm frond, the midrib of it, which is very woody. And it's marvelous for us as archaeologists because it hardens extremely quickly. So you can't fake this inscription, which is actually incised. I know it doesn't look as if it's incised on the photograph, but it is, and I've had it checked by Wilhelmina de Waal in Leiden, where it currently is. They've found thousands of them in the Yemen, and they've tracked down the site of it, and they're carbon datable because they turn into more or less almost wood, although they're the midrib of the leaf. And this one is one of the earliest, and it is of the 9th century BC. So it seems to me very likely indeed that what we have on our Sealand tablet of 1600 BC is actually belongs to this, comes from this different writing material, which is not preserved. So we've been terribly lucky to get one tablet, and there were a couple more that were a bit damaged on the edge, so which probably did have an alphabetic inscription also. So that's a vital thing that I was looking at all the time. We have writing boards of wood and perhaps of ivory, which are mentioned in tablets of Hammurabi's time, but very, very seldom. And we have them increasingly mentioned in the Kassite period, which comes after the Sealand time. But I found that a very interesting thread to pursue through the book. It had already been suggested that almost all the literature that we have written on clay tablets is schoolwork. And this is a bit of a surprise, but considering the number of mistakes that we think we can now recognize, is perhaps not too surprising. And the school tablets that we do find are always in the houses of high officials, almost always. We have very few that are stored in temple libraries until a quite late date. But for this time of Hammurabi and the Sealand dynasty, we have nothing really much from Babylon. There are a few tablets, and they're quite interesting, but there's not a great deal of them. Well, now we're going to rush on into the Assyrian period. And some of you will know that there is a famous throne base of Shalmaneser III, where he's shown clasping hands with the king of Babylon, Marduk Zakir Shumi. And to my amazement, I found that in Damascus Museum, there was an alabaster urn, a very fine piece of alabaster, complete, with exactly the same picture on it as there is on the throne base from Nimrud. So this is the 9th century BC. And I think it's something to look out for, the idea that a motif that you find on a throne base or similar is actually put out elsewhere as a marker of a very important matter. And it is a very important matter because the king of Babylon actually was on a par with the king of Assyria. He wasn't regarded as somebody you had to subdue, and Babylon held a very, very special position in the eyes of the Assyrians. Now, if you have been lucky enough to go to Babylon, you will have seen, undoubtedly, because it's the only thing there apart from restored buildings, you will see this great basalt lion dominating the scene, and it's on a modern plinth or whatever you call it, and it shows an unfinished lion on top of a defeated person. Now, the lion is on the whole a symbol of Assyrian royalty. And there's a pair of ivory ornaments which have got a similar scene on them, and they have what is called a nilotic background. That is, they've got stylized lotuses or water lilies and in the background. So it seemed to me that the likelihood was, and I've put it in my book rather boldly, that this is gone wrong. It seemed to me very likely indeed that this was started when Esarhaddon conquered Egypt in the 7th century BC. And Esarhaddon died on the way back. No, or was it the way there? Sorry, I can't remember. So that this would have been started in the area where basalt is to be found, which is on his route, and carved, brought to Babylon, ready for the triumph that Esarhaddon was going to enjoy when he came to Babylon, of which he was now the king. But dying was a terrible thing to happen because it meant that the oracles had failed the king, that he was unlucky, that the gods had withdrawn their support. So it came back to Babylon, but it never got finished. And not the least reason for that was that Esarhaddon, as we now know, I think, murdered or was responsible with his mother for murdering his father, Sennacherib. Well, that was quite a reason for not finishing it, as well as the fact that Esarhaddon was dead. Well, the Assyrians, for a few reigns, tried to rule Babylon, but the requirements of a king of Babylon were so onerous. All the things that he had, all the festivals that he had to participate in, all the delegates that he had to keep sweet, all the diplomacy that went on, and all the frightful intrigues, many of them by Elam, which meant that no arrangement they ever made stayed for very long. But here we see the Assyrians having finally decided that they couldn't allow Babylon to have its own ruler, even if he was from the Assyrian royal family. This one, Shamash-Shum-Ukin, was corrupted, you could say, by the Elamites, and they tried to take over the city. And what happened was the Assyrians came down and they looted. And this is the crown that they took from Shamash-Shum-Ukin's palace or whatever. And this is his giant official royal seal here, held by an Assyrian officials here. They also took his bed and his chariot. I think this is his chariot coming along behind here. So that was the end of the attempt to keep Assyria, to keep Babylon under the direct control of Assyria. But we're not sure what happened for much after that, because unfortunately, the Assyrian records, which are very full for this period, don't continue. Now, the great thing in the life of Babylon was the annual New Year festival. And this is a tablet that talks about the ritual for that time, found in Babylon, but now in Paris. So many things, so many tablets that come from Babylon were actually sold before Koldovay got there. They were sold by dealers who had dug them out for themselves. And so they went to whichever museum was prepared to buy them. Now, when we come to the city of Babylon itself, we see there is a processional way, which is this line coming down here, and here are the great parts of the southern palace building. Here's the Temple of Nabu, and here is the huge complex of the Temple of Marduk with its ziggurat there. Now, Nebuchadnezzar and his father Nabopolassar were responsible for starting to build this palace at least, with many, many bricks that bear the stamp or the inscription incised of Nebuchadnezzar himself. And that palace was in a terrible place, probably because this was such an enormous ziggurat and bits kept falling off it and it had to be renewed and it was falling apart. But every time the weight of its structure forced the water table up, and this palace suffered as a result. So it's not very surprising that Nebuchadnezzar himself, in the 6th century BC, wanted to make a summer palace, which is way off this chart up here. And he, right. Now that's the ziggurat of Marduk, and this is his huge temple here. And the processional way comes from the Temple of the New Year Festival, where the king had to process, going all the way down there and out the other side. So the king would come out of his palace and pass many different temples for different parts of the ritual, which I've tried to describe in my book. But we think we know that the actual festival changed over time. It was updated, new things were put into it. And it went on for, I think, 12 days. So it was the most enormous event, and all the delegates from other countries came to renew their oaths of loyalty to the king and give him their presents. And he was taken down a peg by having to take off his royal garments and was slapped. And it was a hard slap. The tears were supposed to run. So I often thought we should do that to our leaders once a year. Now, when Cyrus conquered Babylon, he had an inscription written in Babylonian on this prism, a clay prism, which corresponds exactly to other clay prisms by other kings of Babylon. And it's been totally misunderstood. It's really very shocking. We have now found 2 tablets with fragments of the inscription on them, and it shows quite clearly that this was a propaganda piece to bring the locals into line with the new ruler. And it mentions the cities which were given freedom, and those include only Eastern cities. They don't include any Levantine cities or Syrian cities. They only include cities on the way to Susa and around there. So it's been used, of course, in the history of Judeans in a most inappropriate way, and certainly in an inappropriate way by the United Nations, but there we are. So it's a propaganda piece, and it would have been put in the walls of the city, and there must be other examples of it, because we know what prisms were for. They were put in different places in the walls of buildings. Now here we have Darius I, who took over Babylon from the heirs of Cyrus. And here he is at Bisitun, and this part of the carving at Bisitun was put onto a stela that stood on the processional way in Babylon by the Ishtar Gate. So there's another monument that you would have seen if you'd walked along the Ishtar Gate. We don't know quite what the Achaemenid rulers bothered to do in Babylon, but this palace, it's a sort of hilani, it's a pavilion type of building, facing north, but I mean, probably that was the nicest way to face in the sun there, butting straight up against the west side of the huge southern palace. That we now know was built for Artaxerxes II, the Achaemenid king. rather wonderfully, a colleague has found that this is the design of a seal which was used by Berosus, the priest who wrote an account of traditional information for the Greeks. He wrote it in Greek, and he put his seal, which is, it belongs to his office and was used by other people who held the same office as well during his time. Now here is the Wretched Ziggurat, the one that fell down so badly that Alexander, having thought he might restore it, died before he got round to it. It was, well, all the brick was taken off by elephants coming from Bactria, a trail of elephants taking the mud brick off the ziggurat and forming a new mound. I think it's the thought to be the Summer Palace mound. So that we don't know at all what it looked like. But you can see what, well, it's a pity I haven't got a scale on it, but it is the most monstrous construction. And as one knows now from examples in big cities, when a really big and heavy building is put up, the water table rises in the vicinity of it. And that was the trouble, part of the trouble with the Southern Palace. Now, I was interested in what happened to Babylon at this period when it was supposed to have totally Hellenized and fallen in ruins. So I have put up a map where, again, with little asterisks, you can see where it is actually known that the cult of Baal persisted long after the fall of Babylon and well into the Roman period. There's Ashur there, there's Hatra there, there's Erbil there, Nisibin, Edessa, Palmyra, and probably also Antioch. So we'll finish with a couple of things showing that, which is very, very interesting. Now, if you look at Assyrian sculptures, you'll see that when men are swimming, and sometimes they're shown swimming up to the walls of a city by subterfuge in order to catch the locals and get access to a city that is under siege. This is not a swimming figure, it is a figure emerging from the water because she represents, and you can see it's a woman, she's holding her breast off a milk. This is Tiamat emerging from the sea, and here we have a goddess, not Marduk the god, but Ishtar the goddess, who in fact is also called the victor over chaos in the great epic of creation. She's sitting on her lion throne. She has her foot on the defeated Tiamat, and she is the victor. Here we have a wreath of victory and a palm of victory. She is the victor over chaos. And this really wonderful statue of the same motif. I'm not absolutely sure if this is a man or a woman. I think it's a man. This is a copy of the statue of the fortune of Antioch. And it was made by a wonderful sculptor called Eutychides. She has this wonderfully sort of relaxed look of having her foot on all of chaos, which is probably a local version of chaos, the Orontes River, which of course flooded very badly too. And she's holding a palm of victory. And she has on a turreted crown, which actually we found is worn by an Assyrian, a late Assyrian queen. So this is, I think, an indication, though I didn't actually put an asterisk by Antioch on Orontes. I think this is a place where the Epic of Creation in some form would have been known in the Seleucid period, when the heirs of Alexander ruled there. And I was interested in how hard when Alexander died, how hard his family tried to found a dynasty and were unable to, because of course Alexander was so young, he hadn't got a flood of sons to choose from, or even nephews, I think. So it was a very difficult business. Anyway, that's just a few snapshots of this very wonderful city. And to show how little we know, I'll just say briefly that this representation of the Ishtar Gate in Berlin has got stepped merlons on the top, as if a fortification on the Assyrian style. There isn't actually any evidence that I've found for that. And I gather I'm not the only person who's worried about that. There's been a terrible feeling that the Assyrians and the Babylonians are the same people. So, you know, if you could put something up that looked Assyrian, it would do for Babylon as well. But this Ishtar Gate, in fact, has the iconography of Marduk on it. It has the Mushushu dragon, and it has the bull. So it may be that a part of the processional way nearby was dedicated to Ishtar, but this maybe should really be called the Marduk Gate, because Marduk was promoted and promoted over the centuries through his rituals and his Epic of Creation. And so everybody likes to associate him perhaps with this as well. So back to that, and that's my talk.
Stephanie, thank you very much indeed. What an extraordinary journey over several thousand years at one site. So thank you for those wonderful snapshots, and of course just moments in the longer journey as described in your book. So thank you for that. So I'd like to now invite our audience to submit any questions they have in the Q&A, and we have a few arriving there, but while I wait for others to be entered, I'd like to take the opportunity to ask a question myself up front. I don't know, Stephanie, whether you'd like to re-emerge from behind the screen.
I'm trying to re-emerge.
Right.
If I can just find how to do it.
Yeah, perfect. We see you. Yep, lovely. Thank you very much. Great. I think, in fact, we can see you twice, so all the better.
Well, I don't know about that.
Yeah, not to worry. No, it's very good. So, if I may, therefore, I'm going to sort of shamefully, in my introduction, I failed to mention, of course, perhaps one of your most famous publications, and of course, it's The Mystery of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And I just wanted to ask how much you're thinking investigating that story, which of course you relocate very much to Assyria and the achievements of the Assyrian kings, how much by 2013 and your work on that story shaped your interest in developing the history of Babylon that we've heard about this evening.
Well, I wish I could say that I'd thought more about it. I read Caldervey's account of where he thought it might have been, and it seemed to me that he didn't really think it was there from the way he'd written about it. it must have been awful for him, every visitor saying, haven't you found the Hanging Gardens yet? You can imagine the irritation of it for the poor excavator who had too much of that. The building that he did suggest, and I don't know that I can go back to that slide, I better not try. The building, it's a part of the Southern Palace, and it's right in the corner by the Gate of Ishtar. And I think that what he found there, which has got a very interesting water raising mechanism, something like a bucket chain from two wells down there. I think it must have been something like the window of appearances up high, so that the women of the family could look down on the great processions that went on there, and keep an eye on what was going on, really, at least to make an appearance to the public under a bower of vines or whatever they planted there, because nothing that is there, as Koldewey realized, would match any of the accounts of the Hanging Garden. It's way away from anywhere that you could bring water from. You'd have to get it through all sorts of walls of palaces and fortifications. So I don't think there's a chance of it being there. And I think that, I mean, Donald Wiseman and others who made suggestions for the location of it could see that. They realized that Koldewey was not convinced. But with Wiseman, of course, as with Koldewey, there was a desperation to find them in Babylon, and they couldn't. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. Right, we have some more questions for you, and the first one really is I think in relation to your discussion around the Cyrus cylinder, and which you described as propaganda. And so we have a question just really asking, what do you mean by propaganda? Is that an appropriate term for the Cyrus cylinder?
Well, I think it's suitable for all royal inscriptions, really. I'm not making an exception for Cyrus on that count. I'm simply saying that it has to be seen in the tradition of Babylonian royal inscriptions, which are always, if a usurper comes in, it does mean that the gods have withdrawn their support for the previous incumbent of the throne. So the usurper has got to make out that he did things so beautifully and was so accepted by all the people there that he was successful and the gods approved of him. So I think that's the way to look at it. I was amazed when I did realize that the cities to which he'd given freedoms were all on the Tigris side of Mesopotamia and to the east of it.
Thank you for that, because it actually picks up on another question we've been asked, which was just reflecting on the fact that you said the Cyrus cylinder didn't mention or doesn't mention Jerusalem. So reinforcing that idea that it has connections with the biblical world, but as you say, that's not what the geography says.
That's not what the geography says. And of course, we do now have this wonderful archive, or several archives, from sites in central Mesopotamia, which have the records of Judeans who lived there, who must have been deported there after Nebuchadnezzar's taking over Jerusalem. And we found that they were happily settled. They were paying their taxes. The tax collectors have Babylonian names, and the people paying the taxes have Judean names, but the taxes are perfectly normal taxes that everybody had to pay if they were farmers. And that most of the people stayed after you might have expected them to go back to help rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So it's very difficult to assess that because, of course, it's been such a, well, it's almost been a sort of soppy thing to talk about, you know, weeping by the willows. I think they were digging by the willows. They were hard at work, producing enough to feed their families and pay their taxes. And it's all become a very sobby story in current music, literature, and so on, which it can only be corrected, as Haim Tadmor once told me, you'll only correct these stories from contemporary sources if you're lucky enough to get them.
Thank you very much. And talking of contemporary sources, we have a question around your opinion on the Tower of Babel stele from the Shoyin collection, which was published in 2011.
Well, in my opinion, it's definitely a fake. I won't say more than that. I have published exactly why I say so in a review in A Quiet Place, but I am sure about it.
Thank you for that. We have then a question around, can we have more information about the Sealand clay tablet with an alphabetic inscription, and where might it be published?
Right. Well, I published about 473, I think, tablets in the Schoyen collection in a series called the Cornell University Studies in Sumerian and Akkadian. It's number 9 in a series that's now reached, I think, about 42. And it's got photographs and so on. I had it looked at before I published it by several people, and they were as puzzled as I was until I found out about the palm midribs from Yemen. And then I realized that actually we needed to sort of shift our ideas perhaps away from the Levant if we were looking for the origins of alphabetic writing in general. But I don't suppose the Yemen ones are in Aramaic. They're probably some early Arabian language. And I don't know how, I haven't found any connections between Arabia and the Sealand.
Thank you very much. And now quite a detailed question around the interpretation of names. The relationships between the names Babel and Kadingira. The question is Kadingira really a later translation in Sumerian from a non-Akkadian toponym interpreted as God's door by Akkadians?
Well, that's a question that I don't think one can be sure of the answer. Just to do an analogy, I think, with Erbil, that we know that it was called Urbilum, Urbilum, at a very early period. And then because that sounds like 4 gods, it became 4 gods town, Arba Ilum, or Arba Ili. So I think probably Babylon has something of that in it. And it's just so nice to think of Babel and the confusion of languages and all that sort of thing. But again, we don't know what period that story in the Old Testament comes from. So people loved playing with names. And I think that it's impossible to get to the original, the origin of it. But there's no particular evidence that it was meaningful, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Then a question around the iconography of Marduk and whether you could interpret that iconography of the Marduk statue from the 9th century cylinder seal. think you showed I think this must refer to the
with Shamash Shamukin.
Yes.
Right, with the Assyrian sculpture of the looting of the king's things, his personal possessions or his royal possessions. Yes. So we do know of a very large seal which belonged to the king, which I haven't shown a picture of, but there's no doubt that there was a really grand seal which was the king's personal possession, as opposed to royal seals, which he, rather like the Pope, he would give them out to his cardinals, as it were, and they would use royal seals, but they're different from the one royal seal that was the possession of the king.
Thank you. And then a question around temple facades. I think you mentioned briefly, perhaps when looking at the stele of Hammurabi, that the reference to the facade.
Oh, yes.
If you could elaborate a little more on that.
Yes, well, it's unfortunate that my book is so packed with things, I couldn't decide what to put into this talk. What has been discovered from tablets at Mari on the Middle Euphrates in the time of Hammurabi is that the Elamites controlled cities in southern Mesopotamia, northern Mesopotamia, all the way around the Fertile Crescent and down into Palestine. And it was only at the end of his reign, when Hammurabi defeated him, no doubt with a selection of allies, that their control, which had lasted for a couple of reigns at least, perhaps centered on Larsa, which was the other place that Hammurabi had to defeat. Actually, we had Elamite control of the whole cuneiform world at that time by the Elamites, which has been absolutely staggering. And at that time, the temples that were built have facades that resemble date palms. And I've got quite a lot about that in the book, because it is really not very well known. I think that, and this is just a guess, we know that the Elamites had groves as temples, outdoor temples, as you might say, sacred groves. And it seems very likely that it's an Elamite translation of a sacred place onto the mud brick facades of that period, because it's just at that period that they happen. They're at Tel Eilan, Tel al-Rimah, Shemshara, Larsa itself, a couple of other sites in Lower Babylonia. It's really an extraordinary thing. The Larsa one lasted the longest. It's been shown that it was still like as if it was decorated with palm trees in mud brick, right down into the later period.
Thank you. And then a follow-up question to back to Marduk again, and the idea of the Marduk statue, the Marduk Asuluhi statue. Do you have anything to contribute to our understanding of Marduk's clothing and dress from that statue?
I'm not sure about Marduk's dress. I'm sure the fashion's changed. But I don't, yes. I think the statues were composite, that they would have been made of all the precious materials you could get together at the time. So they would have been of timbers as well as precious stones, as well as precious metals. But I just don't know what they would have looked like at any particular time. When you see the sun god on the Hammurabi stela, he's not wearing very decorated looking clothes. He's got the flounced robe, which comes out of fashion later on. So I'm uneasy about giving a very definite answer to that.
Thank you. And then a question, which are greetings from UC Santa Barbara, from John Lee, who thanks you for this fascinating talk. And he asks, how can the study of Babylon expand our understanding of ancient urban life, which of course students often learn about through lenses of Athens or Rome? A very large question, but it's possible to offer some ideas.
Right. Well, I find that a difficult business. One has to rely to a large extent on Hammurabi's code, for example, for the treatment of women, where I think they were very well treated in some ways. For example, if their husband was a trader and he went away and he stayed away for several years, she was entitled to take another husband, because, and he might come back again, and then if they had children, if she had children by both, they had an equal share in the inheritance. But that was so that a woman wouldn't be left in the gutter. And I think that's an important aspect of things. The fact that these priestesses from royal families, I mean, some of the women were sent out to marry abroad, and they had no feeling that you must marry within your tribe or anything like that. The women were bargaining chips. They were sent off to marry foreign kings if they appealed, you know, if they were beautiful and presentable and so on. And some of the others, or perhaps when they were widowed, they could become priestesses and go and trade. So they were very, they were quite liberated in that sort of way. One of the things about, I hate the idea of trying to discuss the economy of the place, but I do think it's very interesting that glass production seems to have started at the time of at least the Sealand, the first Sealand dynasty, around 1600, because we do have a glass recipe text attributed to a Sealand king, and there are other indications, not least the wonderful glass axe heads, of which you have some, I think, in the Ashmolean Museum, which show that these glass axe heads of different colors were prized objects. And it has been found and noticed, but not enough, I think. It was Henry Wright in Adams's book on Lower Mesopotamia, the discovery of a plant that would have been ideal as a flux, I think you call it, for making glass. And I've wondered whether the so-called Sasanian fields of glass around the south of Iraq, in fact, go back, way back to the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. So I think there's something for somebody who's expert in that sort of thing to look at, but it isn't me.
Thank you. That's a wonderful sort of, as it were, idea of how your book enables those sorts of questions to be asked, because traveling across 2000 years with, as you said, packed with things, it really is. And this talk this evening has been a wonderful example of the sorts of connections and journey that you've been able to achieve in this extraordinary piece of learning. So Stephanie, for both the book, which you know, I'm not a promoter, so, but I'm very happy to promote. So thank you for that book, but also for this extraordinary and wonderfully illuminating lecture this evening. Very grateful indeed. Thank you very much. And I'd just like to thank everybody who's joined us this evening. Thank you for being here. And to say that alongside the Zoom lectures that the British Institute for the Study of Iraq is able to offer you, we're now returning also to our in-person talk. So those of you who are able to come to London on the 10th of November, we have our patrons, Sir Terence Clarke, talking on the evolution of the Saluki as an enduring part of the cultural heritage of the Middle East. So you can see our range of subjects stretches from antiquity to the now, which is the whole purpose of the Institute. So thank you for joining us, and thank you again, Stephanie, for this incredible experience and journey through the history of Babylon. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.